Welcome back to this sessions on Incoterms 2020. We will now discuss each and every term one by one. In part 1, we saw as an introduction to the various contracts, starting from the contract of sale, related contracts of carriage, contracts of insurance, and other interfaces which are coming with customs and documentation. Let us now jump into the specific discussion on Incoterms. I have mentioned both 2010 as well as 2020 here because most of you must be familiar with 2010, which has been in use now and still continuing to be used. But we will also discuss what are the variations which are there in the 2020 version and how to apply them, how to interpret them. Right from inception, then the 1930s when Incoterms was introduced in Europe and then internationally, it has evolved based on trade patterns, based on banking systems, based on shipping documents, based on types of packaging being used, types of ships being used, containerization being a major game changer in this whole aspect of trading. So therefore, we will analyze each and every term and also look at the salient features and the responsibilities of the parties involved in this whole chain. The Incoterms have got two main divisions. The 11 Incoterms are divided based on two factors. One is for any mode of transport. As we know, logistics involves transport by multiple modes. So the Incoterms also facilitate depending upon the mode of transport. So there are 7 terms which can be used for any mode of transport, and 4 of the terms out of the 11 can be used only for water transport or inland waterways. So under any mode of transport, in group E, we have got only one term, which is Ex Works. Then we have got group F, where the main carriage is unpaid by the seller. You have to keep in mind that all the Incoterms are with reference to the responsibilities of the seller. So under group F, for any mode of transport, we have got one term, which is FCA, free carrier. Then we have got group C, where the main carriage is paid by the seller. There are two terms there, which is CPT, carriage paid to, CIP, which is carriage and insurance paid to a particular destination. And then you have got group D, which is known as arrival terms. There are 3 terms. Again, bear in mind, these are the 2010 terms. So you got DAT, delivered at terminal, DAP, delivered at place, and DDP, which is delivered duty paid. We'll be discussing each of these terms in the coming slides. Now we have got 4 terms, which is only for sea transport or inland waterways, where there is no other mode of transport. So here we have got only 2 groups, which is starting from group F, which is FAS and FOB. FAS stands for free alongside ship and FOB is free on board the ship. And you've got 2 C terms, which is CFR, cost and freight, CIF, which is cost, insurance and freight. CFR many times is incorrectly referred to as C&F, CNF, C plus F, etc. Though the intent of the parties may be the same as CFR, it is always recommended that you use the most common term or the most appropriate term as defined in the Incoterms by the International Chamber of Commerce. Now let us analyze each and every term. So we start with Ex Works. So in this particular slide, you will see a picture which depicts the movement right from the seller's warehouse up to the buyer's warehouse with all the multiple activities which comes in between, including documentation, mode of transport up to main carriage, and then going all the way up to the buyer's premises warehouse. Here you will find 3 blocks which shows the movement of cost, S stands for seller, and here there's a responsibility of the buyer. And then you've got the second one, which talks about risk on the cargo. And the third one is the responsibility of insurance. Normally, yes, the risk and insurance goes together, but there are two terms we will see where the risk is different from the responsibility of the insurance. So let us analyze the different aspects which comes in a transaction. So starting from, say, staging of the cargo, which means getting the cargo prepared. So when we looked at the grocery example, the staging is done by the seller where the cargo is already kept ready. So in X works also, we have got a option where the staging is done by the seller of the cargo. So in effect, actually, the responsibility of the seller is only to keep the cargo ready, and everything else which happens, right, from export clearance, then the pre-carriage from the warehouse to the main carriage, loading onto the main carriage, the main transport, offloading from the main carriage, insurance for the cargo, import clearance at the destination, and then on carriage from the port or airport or wherever it is, the main, after the ending the main carriage, is also the responsibility of the buyer, right? Now you will see that I've put a question mark on export. Now you will see that as defined by Incoterms, export clearance in the case of X works has to be done by the buyer. But this many times poses a lot of practical issues. A buyer, say example, buying from China, a buyer based in Dubai buying from China on X works basis would need an export clearance from that particular country. Normally the export clearance is only with the seller of the goods or who is a manufacturer, and they need an export license for the same. But most of the times we find that though a buyer is contracting to buy on X works basis, the seller does the export clearance. Bear in mind, as defined by Incoterms, the seller is not responsible. So if something goes wrong with that, tomorrow the seller can always raise his hands and say, sorry, I'm not responsible. Though it has been done for the last 3 years in all the shipments, the seller can at any point of time say that he is no longer responsible for the same, and there is no recourse, a legal recourse, which can be brought in against the seller because he is not bound to do that as per the Incoterms X works. Right? So therefore, it is very important to understand that if something goes wrong, who will be liable to mitigate the losses. Now, the second important aspect there where a lot of confusion exists in terms of X works is loading. Again, many of the traders who buy on X works basis, when I ask this question, they say that yes, I buy X works, but loading onto the container or to the trailer, onto the vehicle which is placed at the warehouse of the seller is done by the seller. Again, going back to what exactly is defined in Incoterms, in the case of X works, the seller is not responsible for loading onto the buyer's vehicle. In practice, yes, it is happening. But again, imagine a situation where something goes wrong. Suppose the seller's workers or the forklift goes and damages the product or damages the vehicle, damages the container, or there is harm caused or injury caused to the personnel there. The seller can always say that, sorry, I'm not legally liable for the damages which are caused. So it is always important to understand what exactly is being done, map it out first, and then decide, because there are definite terms which suits these kind of activity. So there are pros and cons. The seller always thinks that yes, they have the least responsibility when selling on X works. That is true. The buyer, since he has been buying for a long time on X works, they continue to do, though it is an additional responsibility which is there on part of the buyer to do the loading as well as the export clearance. As I gave in the summary sheet initially, this particular term, the X works, is applicable for all modes of transport and combination of transport. The next term which is under this series where it is used for all modes of transport or combinations is FCA. It stands for Free on Carrier at the named place of delivery. So the picture remains the same, but you will now find that the boxes or the bars which are below that picture with respect to cost, risk and insurance starts moving. As I said, Incoterms are always analyzed from the seller's perspective. Therefore, you will find that as we analyze the terms right from number 1 to number 11, or say number 1 to 7 and then the next 4, you will find that the seller's responsibility progressively increases. So what are those? The elements of the responsibility. Staging, it's the seller's responsibility. Loading onto the vehicle which is placed in the seller's warehouse is the seller's responsibility. So this is where the variation comes between XWorks and FCA. In XWorks, it is a buyer's responsibility to do the loading, though in practice many times the seller does it. So I would recommend that it is better if the seller is doing the loading, bearing the cost for that loading, it is better to convert those sales terms into FCA rather than sticking to XWorks. Second point where the confusion was in XWorks was about export clearance. In FCA, again, that is very clearly defined that export clearance is the seller's responsibility. And then everything else is the buyer's responsibility. So right from pre-carriage, I'll come back to that in a minute, put a question mark there. Loading onto the main carriage, the main transport, offloading from main carriage, insurance on the cargo from wherever the buyer is taking the responsibility, import clearance at destination, on carriage from that main port onto the buyer's warehouse, everything becomes the buyer's responsibility. In pre-carriage, I am a slight variation. There's a slight variation there because there are 2 points at which an FCA can happen. One is FCA seller's warehouse, in which case the pre-carriage is done by the buyer, which means that the buyer is arranging the vehicle to go to the seller's warehouse to load the cargo. But FCA can also be at a different place. It can be a CFS, for example. Suppose it's an LCL cargo, right? Or even other cargoes where there has to be a consolidation which has to happen. And the seller agrees that he would transport it from his warehouse to that CFS. In which case, FCA, the point of transfer, the point of delivery can be defined as FCA CFS Jebel Ali. In which case, the pre-carriage will be done by the seller. The expenses and the risk for that particular pre-carriage will be with the seller. So this is a variation FCA. So it can happen in 2 different points of delivery. Again, this is applicable for all modes and combinations. The next one, so we have seen that in all modes and combinations, you've got E terms is one which is XWorks, F term is one which is FCA. Now we come to the C terms. So the first one is carriage paid to, up to a certain place. The picture is the same, but if you see the bars below, you will find that the cost responsibility of the seller has gone up to the destination port in this particular example, right? So that is what it is implied, where the seller is paying the cost of carriage up to a particular place. But you will find that the risk and insurance has not moved. Why is it so? It's because in normal trading pattern and the kind of practices which are there, it is still considered that the ultimate beneficiary of the entire transaction is the buyer. So even if there's an activity which is being done by the seller, in this particular case, the seller is arranging for the transport. Obviously, the seller is building up that cost also into the overall pricing. They don't want to take the risk beyond a certain point. Therefore, in the case of CPT, the risk passes to the buyer at the first point of loading into the first vehicle, even at the pre-carriage section. Even though the transport is arranged by the seller, the risk passes to the buyer at the first point of loading. Therefore, insurance, since the buyer is carrying the risk from that particular point, it is imperative that they have to arrange for the insurance at their cost and they remain the beneficiary of that particular insurance. So quickly analyzing the cost, the elements of the responsibility, staging, export clearance, even the pre-carriage, the loading onto the main carriage, transportation cost for the main carriage, and offloading in certain cases. Again, I put a question mark, I'll come back to that. All this becomes the responsibility of the seller. Insurance, right from the point where the risk is transferred, becomes the responsibility of the buyer because they are carrying the risk. Import clearance is with the buyer, any on carriage, etc., and offloading from that final vehicle, everything remains as a responsibility of the buyer. Now, unloading, I put a question mark because in CPT, it depends upon what kind of cargo and what kind of transport is being engaged. For example, if it's a container shipment, it is a normal practice which exists that the offloading of the container is done by the container terminal, and there is a TSC which is being charged, which is ultimately being borne by the buyer as per the terms which is there in the sales contract. And there is a similar contract which exists between the seller who is contracting for the carriage up to that particular point. But imagine a situation where it is a break bulk cargo, where the unloading is also included in the sales contract, and therefore the sellers take the responsibility while contracting for the carriage to say that, yes, I will ensure that the vessel which I am arranging will offload the cargo and keep it at the port, in which case the unloading charges will be included by the seller in their pricing and they take the responsibility for that. So that is where there can be a variation. It's not 100% defined or put as sacrosanct that it has to be done by the seller or the buyer. So again, this is applicable for all modes of transport. The next one in this set of 7 Incoterms is carriage and insurance paid to, which is CIP. If you look at the responsibility chart at the bottom here, you will find that what has moved is the responsibility of insurance. Everything else remains the same as CPT. So what is the variation here? Let's quickly look at the various elements: staging, pre-carriage, export clearance, loading onto main carriage, main transport, unloading. Again, it's a matter of negotiation, is all done by the seller. And here now we find that insurance is also done by the seller up to the point where they have agreed to transport the cargo or deliver the cargo. Why is this so? Because there could be many reasons why the seller does the insurance, but we have to bear in mind that even if seller is doing the insurance, the beneficiary of that insurance will be the buyer, because the risk is still with the buyer. The seller is not assuming the risk. The seller has already passed the risk at the first point of loading, similar to what happens in CPT. But it's only that seller is contracting for the insurance, paying that premium, but in the insurance certificate, the buyer will be the beneficiary. So, which means that if at all anything goes wrong, any loss or damage to the cargo, the buyer will have to go and claim for that particular insurance. As I said, there are many reasons for this. Some of the export regimes, they very clearly say that any export has to be done only with insurance. Therefore, it is done by the seller. In certain cases, the seller doesn't know as to where the cargo is going to be sold. There are many cases where there is a bulk load which is done and sale happens later in high seas. So therefore, the seller has to ensure that there is insurance coverage at any point of time. Or certain cases, the buyer themselves request, because seller may have a better arrangement with insurance companies with better insurance premiums, etc. Therefore, they request the seller to do that insurance. All the other responsibilities remain with the buyer. In terms of the import clearance, Any on carriage which is there, any offloading which is there from that on carriage, everything remains the responsibility of the buyer. This particular term is again applicable for all modes of transport and combinations. So that covers the C terms, the two terms which are there. Now we come to the D terms. There are three of them, which is the first one is delivered at place. So again, bear in mind that this is as per Incoterms 2020. So there is a rearrangement which is there, the variation which is there from Incoterms 2010 version into 2020 version is that the delivered at terminal term, that one has been removed and there's a new term which comes in. So delivered at place, it was already existing in 2010 version. And here, if you observe the responsibility chart here, you will find that the risk also now is with the seller up to a particular point. Earlier, we found that in C terms, even though the seller was doing the transportation, paying for the transportation or even paying for the insurance, the risk had transferred to the buyer at the first point of loading. But the moment you cross over into D terms, the seller is assuming additional risk up to the point of delivery, which is very close to the point of destination or even beyond the initial port of discharge. So what are the various responsibilities? So right from staging, pre-carriage, export clearance, loading onto main carriage, main transportation cost, unloading from the main carriage, insurance up to the point where it is agreed, where seller is bearing the risk, the seller does the insurance. Import clearance remains with the buyer. So it's a bit of sometimes an issue, an ambiguity which can come in. The import point or clearance point can be, or mostly it is defined along with the point of discharge of the main carriage, which could be an airport, which could be a seaport, etc., or a border. But the seller has got the responsibility to even transport beyond that particular point inland. So in the contractual agreement which is there, it has to be very clearly mentioned. Yes, Incoterms defines that it is buyer's responsibility to do the import clearance. They should have the import license, etc., or payment of duty which is required. But it has to be explicitly mentioned that when they would do that, because there's a potential that there could be a demurrage or detention which happens in the cargo just because the buyer has not completed those formalities. So wherever there is a potential for ambiguity, even though it is defined under Incoterms, it is better that it is explicitly defined in the contract of sale and purchase of cargo. On carriage, yes, it is the sellers. If they have agreed that that point is beyond the normal port. Now, DAP can also be the port of discharge of the cargo, the airport or the seaport, in which case there is no on carriage responsibility with the seller. But if that point, the destination which is named is inland, which is beyond the point of the primary discharge of cargo, then on carriage will be the seller's responsibility. Any offloading to be done from that vehicle remains with the buyer. This is applicable for all modes and combinations, which is multimodal transport. So what has to be borne in mind here is that in D terms, there are additional risks for the seller. There are risks with respect to timing of arrival of the cargo. There are risks with respect to quantity and quality of cargo. Many traders are not aware that once they are doing a sale on D terms, they are liable for timing or even quantity based on arrival. It's just like the pizza example which I gave. Unless it reaches the doorstep of the buyer, the quantity and quality can be something which is subject to inspection. Many times it is assumed that quantity and quality is as per the loading point, or for example as per the inspection which was done at the point of loading. But strictly speaking, as per Incoterms, the buyer can always say that they will pay only for what they received. So again, it is always better, wherever there is a potential ambiguity, go back and define this very clearly in the contract of sale as to how quantity and quality would be calculated. is there any commitment on the arrival timing? Again, taking the pizza example, there are many companies which advertise and say that if you don't get that in 30 minutes, consider it free. That is a commitment of timing. So similar thing can happen here the moment you are using a D term. The second term under the D terms here is DPU, which is delivered at place unloaded, which is a new term which is in the 2020 version. We do not see this particular term in the 2010 version. It is not an exact replacement of DAT, but it's kind of a combination which is based on the current industry practices. So as the name implies, delivered at place unloaded, which means unloaded by the seller. So which means that any type of shipment where the seller has to unload the cargo and then keep it at the disposal of the buyer, this particular term should be used. So it's the responsibility chart is almost similar to what you saw in DAP. However, we'll see that all the usual aspects of staging, pre-carriage, export clearance, loading onto main transport, the main transport cost, main unloading is becomes the responsibility of the seller. Insurance up to the point of delivery is with the seller, and then import clearance still remains with the buyer, right? As in DAP, in DPU also the import clearance responsibility is with the buyer. Any on carriage which is there is the responsibility of the seller if it is agreed. If the place is agreed as somewhere which is an inland destination away from the main terminal, then on carriage is also seller's responsibility. And any unloading also, if the point of delivery, the point of ultimate transfer is defined as an inland destination, the unloading from that vehicle also becomes the seller's responsibility. For example, if you agree DPU at buyer's warehouse, it means that the entire cost of transportation, it is very clear that it is the seller's responsibility. However, even the unloading of the cargo from the arriving vehicle at the buyer's warehouse also will be seller's responsibility. Whereas if DPU, the point of transfer, is defined as the port, in that case, only offloading from the main carriage is the responsibility of the seller, which they have to build in the contract of carriage. Again, as mentioned in the previous D term, the seller should be aware that there are additional risks on timings, quantity and quality which the seller is taking up to the point of destination unless it is otherwise defined in the sales contract. This term also is applicable for all modes and components. The last one, the seventh term under the set of 7 terms for all modes of transport is DDP. Again, a very commonly used term. So what changes here? You'll find that the entire responsibility chart of the seller, it has moved up to a point which is even beyond the normal point of delivery, which can run up to the point of the warehouse of the buyer. But one of the major changes here is that the seller is now undertaking to even pay for the charges, the import charges which are there in the buyer's destination. So all the general terms, it remains as the responsibility of the seller. The staging of cargo, pre-carriage, export clearance, loading onto main carriage, transportation costs, offloading from main carriage, insurance up to the point where they are taking the risk, the point of delivery, import clearance. So this is one major difference. You will find that all the other terms, the import clearance is the responsibility of the buyer. In the case of DDP, the import clearance is the responsibility with the seller. So similar to what we discussed in X-Works, where the buyer has a responsibility to do the export clearance from the point where he is buying the cargo, which could be a problem. Here also, when a seller is contracting to sell on DDP terms, he is assuming the responsibility. But again, in normal practice, we see that the buyer will be giving all the papers required because they are the ones normally who has the import clearance. But imagine a situation where the cargo arrives and due to some reason the buyer is not able to do, or their license has expired, or whatever reason they are not able to do the import clearance, they can always go back and say that as per the Incoterms, it is the seller's responsibility. Which means that the seller should appoint an agent, or they should have a license to import this cargo, without which they will be breaching their contractual responsibility under Incoterms. So it's extremely important to focus on these potential areas of ambiguity. Any on carriage which is there, yes, the point is beyond the normal port or terminal, the seller should arrange for that and pay for it. And this is applicable for all modes or combinations. Any unloading, it is normally done by the buyer, but again it is a matter of negotiation where it can even be done by the seller but incorporated into the contract. Additional risk here as compared to even the other two D terms, import license and import duty, or any variation which can come in import duty. If it is a long-term contract, that risk is also with the seller. So now let us look at the other four terms which we discussed initially when we looked at the bifurcation. You had 7 terms which is applicable for all modes and combinations, and now you have 4 terms which is used only for 100% sea transport or inland waterways. The first one is free alongside ship, where you find that the cost, and the risk, and therefore the insurance by the seller is only up to the point of keeping the cargo ready at an agreed port and agreed place. So which means that loading of the cargo is the responsibility of the buyer. The main contract of carriage is done by the buyer. They will be arranging the ship, but when they do that, they also include that the ship should have the facility to load the cargo, or they would arrange additional stevedores there to ensure that the cargo is loaded. The responsibility of the seller is only to deliver the cargo at an agreed place in that particular port or terminal. So looking at the various elements there, they make the cargo ready, they have to do the export clearance, and any pre-carriage which is required to bring the cargo to the port or the agreed place is the responsibility of the seller. Loading is the responsibility of the buyer. Transportation, any other the main transport cost, further unloading, insurance from that point onwards, import clearance, any on carriage, entire responsibility remains that of the buyer. However, you will find that the seller is taking the risk till such time they are transporting it to the cargo till the port where it is agreed, which means that they carry the risk on that cargo. Therefore, any insurance which is required up to that particular point should be done by the seller. Now, one area of ambiguity or potential confusion which can happen here is that what happens between the time of delivery of the cargo to the port and loading onto the ship. Suppose the cargo was delivered on the 5th of April and the ship is arriving on the 10th of April, which means for 5 days the cargo is sitting at the port. And if something happens to that cargo, it is damaged or lost, who bears that risk? As per this Incoterm, it is very, very clear that right from the time it is delivered onto the agreed place, the seller's responsibility is completed. Therefore, when the buyer is contracting for insurance, they have to mention very clearly that the insurance coverage which they are seeking should also include a potential period of storage in the port of origin. So this particular term, again, bear in mind that it should be used only where the cargo is going to go only in marine or waterways. The next term here is FOB, which is again a very common term which is used. The major difference, you'll find that this particular bar here, the responsibility of the seller has moved a little bit, which includes loading of the cargo onto the ship. As the name implies, it is free on board. The seller is taking the responsibility till such time the cargo is placed on board the ship. So staging of cargo, export clearance is all the seller's responsibility. Any pre-carriage to bring it up to the port, and then loading onto the ship has also moved as seller's responsibility. Main transport, offloading from the main transport, insurance right from the point of the ship where it is loaded at the origin port, import clearances, on carriage, etc. Everything remains as the buyer's responsibility. Again, this is something which has to be used only for 100% marine, should not be used for combination. One of the common errors again which happens in trade is the use of the term FOB or CIF and CFR for container shipments. The main ambiguity or the risk which is there is that in containers it is a multimodal transport. A container you cannot have a containerized shipment which is just originating from the port of loading onto the ship. So therefore, the ambiguity comes from the fact that there is an inland transport which is involved, whereas if you use the term FOB, the risk to the buyer starts only right from the time when the container is on board the ship. Whereas many of the times the seller presumes that their risk is over when it is loaded into the container at their warehouse. There have been many cases where there are accidents or loss of cargo which happens right from the point between the seller's warehouse and the port, and at that time they realize that since they used FOB, the buyer's insurance does not cover it for the pre-carriage, and neither the seller covered it because that is the way they have done business as for the past so many months or so many years. So be very, very clear that when Incoterms is giving an advisory, it doesn't mean that you should stop selling containers just because your other party doesn't agree for any other term. But if you are agreeing for a term which is not the perfect fit for that particular, the way in which the trade is done or the way in which the transportation is done, be aware of the risk, the residual risk which can come, which is beyond the contractual obligation. So carriage conditions becomes very, very important here. There could be mostly with respect to chartering a ship and what all terms which needs to be disclosed to the other party, because there is an explicit contract which comes with the counterparties at the origin or destination. Moving on, there are two terms now left to be discussed under the C terms for marine and inland waterway. So you'll find here that the responsibility of cost of the seller has gone up to the point, up to the destination, normally the discharge port. It is similar to CPT, which we discussed earlier. So here also we will find that the seller is taking the responsibility of only the freight, whereas the risk has passed to the buyer at the loading port itself, whereby the buyer's responsibility is also there to do the insurance for the cargo right from the point on at the load port. So the various elements, staging, export clearance, pre-carriage if any, also becomes the seller's responsibility, loading cost onto the ship, chartering the ship, paying for the transport, the main transport is the seller's responsibility, any unloading, so which means that the seller has to include any potential unloading cost also in the overall costing which they are doing. However, insurance for the main carriage is the buyer's responsibility, import clearance, any potential on carriage, all remains with the buyer. So here also carriage conditions, whatever is defined, it becomes important. If the seller is, since the seller is doing the contract of carriage, but there is an interface at the other end with the buyer's discharge facilities or terminal which they are contracting for. Therefore, it is important that the relevant carriage conditions need to be advised to them either in the contract of sale or in the nomination of the ships. The last one here is the cost, insurance and freight. So again, like what we discussed in CIP, you will find that yes, the risk is passing to the buyer at the point of loading at the origin port. However, the cost of insurance is paid by the seller, but it is on behalf of the buyer. So the beneficiary in the insurance certificate will remain as the buyer. So all the aspects of pre-carriage, export, loading, main transportation, unloading, insurance is also done by the seller. Beneficiary remains the buyer. All the other aspects of import, clearances, any on carriage is the buyer's responsibility. So just to summarize the 2020 Incoterms, the main divisions here, as the initial chart which we saw was with respect to Incoterms 2010. So any mode of transport, it remains the main ones remain the same. X works, you got one F term which is FCA, the C term which is CPT and CIP. What has changed between 2010 and 2020 is in the D terms. Here you have delivered at place, unloaded by the seller, and then delivered duty paid. The four terms with respect to sea and inland waterways remain the same between 2010 and 2020. That was the end of part 2 in the series of 3 sessions on Incoterms 2020. Here we looked at each and every term. What are the kind of potential ambiguities which can come, which needs to be taken care of in the contract of sale. In part 3, we will summarize and also look at some of the other guidance which is available to ensure that we are all use Incoterms 2020 in the right manner. Thank you.